Hello and good afternoon again to everyone who's joining. Thank you for participating in our webinar today on the new Perkins Act for Career and Technical Education Programs, or Perkins 5 as we are calling it for shorthand. It is the Strengthening Career and Technical Education for the 21st Century Act officially, and was just given a new public law number 115224. We know people will be joining still, but we want to go ahead and get started because we have a lot of information to share in the next hour and want to get through as much as possible. And the first thing we want to talk about is a little bit of recap on what has happened over the past month and how we got to today. Many of you on the webinar have probably been following Perkins reauthorization over the past several years, and things were moving very slowly through the process until just a few weeks ago. The House had passed its Perkins reauthorization bill actually twice, first in 2016 and then again in June of 2017. And that bill was numbered H.R. 2353, passed overwhelmingly both times, bipartisan support, and a lot of momentum behind the work going on in the House. However, over in the Senate, things stalled both times, including in 2017. And the big area of disagreement between Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats was over the idea of secretarial authority, how much authority the Secretary of Education should have over state and local plans, over state and local accountability systems, and programming. This debate was not really specific to CTE. It grew out of conversations and concerns around the implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act and spilled over into debate around CTE. We know that Congress was very concerned over this issue, and really that's what shaped the rest of the reauthorization process in the Senate. It wasn't around many of the issues that we in the CTE community care the most about, like programs of study or the local plan or any of those pieces of the legislation, but really this idea of secretarial authority. And so you'll see that in a lot of the changes that were ultimately made in the final law reflect the compromises that they came to over the last few weeks. So as we started, the first thing that happened was that the Senate released draft bill text just over a month ago on June 20th. Then just a couple of days later, they marked it up in committee, approved it on June 26th by the Senate Help Committee, and then moved it very quickly with a few changes to the floor. The Senate passed their bill, which was eventually numbered S3217, on July 23rd. Then on July 25th, the House took up that bill. When the Senate passed it, it actually took up the House bill and amended the House bill so that it still has the House bill number, and that eased its passage through what can sometimes be a very complicated legislative process. Then the bill had to go back to the House because it looked different than it did the first time they passed it. It was approved by the House on July 25th, and as most everybody knows at this point, on July 31st was signed into law as Public Law 115224. So that was a lot to happen in a single month. Most of the time when legislation moves through Congress, it takes many months. You might have a conference committee between the House and Senate passed bills, but none of that happened this time, and it was a very quick Senate process. And so some of the things that ended up in the legislation could have used a bit more refinement, and those are things that will, as we discuss on the call today, will come up during implementation, and that we'll be working closely with the Department of Education on during implementation to smooth out some of the issues that exist currently in the legislation. So I want to jump right into the structure of the law. It looks very much like current law. You won't see significant changes in how it looks other than two key things. One is that the current Title II, which is the Tech Prep program, as well as Section 118, which is the Occupational and Employment Information Program, have been eliminated. Both of those programs have not been funded in a number of years. Section 118 has not been funded since 2005, even before the last Perkins reauthorization, and the current Title II program has not been funded since 2010. So the text of those programs was eliminated, and that changed some of the section and title numbering throughout the rest of the law. Three key funding streams remain. Title I is the basic state grant. Section 114 is the national activity section of the law, and that gets a separate funding through the appropriations process. And then Section 117 is the tribally controlled post-secondary CTE institutions program, which also has a separate funding stream through the appropriations process. As I mentioned, some of the numbering changed due to the elimination of Title II. The old Title III, which includes administrative provisions, now is Title II. And Title III of this particular bill included amendments to the Wagner-Pizer Act as well as to WIOA and ESSA, which helped replace some of the language in those bills that reference the old Perkins law. A couple of key things about timing. One is that the effective date for this piece of legislation is July 1st of 2019. So what that means is that everything under current Perkins law will continue for the upcoming school year. The accountability system, the uses of funds, the plans, everything that's in effect right now will continue for the entirety of the next school year. And then the first year of implementation of the new law will be what's called a transition year in federal legislation, and that will run from July 1, 2019 to June 30th of 2020. During the transition year, states will submit scaled down information to the Department of Education, what's called a transition plan, and will begin collecting baseline data on new performance measures. The Department of Education will be issuing guidance over the next few months on exactly what has to be included in that transition plan versus what will get included in the full plan that states will submit the following year. But that guidance will then trickle down to local programs as well through states, and it will be up to states to determine the procedures for local recipients of funds, school districts, and post-secondary institutions for that transition year. Generally speaking, though, based on past practice and what we've heard so far, the majority of the new requirements around for example, the local needs assessment will not have to be completed until full 4-year plans are submitted, which will be for that year after the transition year, starting July 1 of 2020. So even though we have a brand new law, it's important to remember that there is an extended timeline for transitioning to it. So any of the new pieces and policies and requirements, there'll be plenty of time for states and locals to think through the best way to implement and to ensure an orderly transition from the current law to the new law. So moving on, every piece of federal legislation practically starts with a purpose section. And the purposes of Perkins have long been to ensure the academic and technical skills of students so that they're able to pursue productive employment. The purposes in the new law stay very similar to current law. There's just one main addition that is added to that section, and that is to increase the employment opportunities for populations who are chronically unemployed or underemployed, including a list of special populations mirroring much of the special population list included later in the law. And this new purpose really is a signal of one of the themes of the Act, and that is that special populations and students with disabilities are receiving more focus throughout this piece of legislation than in current law. You'll see a number of new references to performance gaps as well as new places where these populations are specifically called out. And in many of these cases, it was reflective of priorities of members of Congress in both the House and the Senate to ensure that all students have equal access to high-quality CTE programs. One other slight addition in the purposes section is a reference to employability skills in addition to the academic and technical skills that have been there for a period of time. This reflects the conversation really around the country related to the skills gap and the need for students to have not only academic and technical skills, but those 21st century skills or employability skills as well. The next key section of the legislation is the definition section. There are a total of 28 new definitions in this new law. One of the places where the most significant changes were made as you look across the legislation. There are now a total of 55 terms defined, and many of those include details that will have to be considered as you implement other pieces of the legislation. So it's important to pay attention to what terms actually mean to ensure that you're meeting all of the requirements. Over half of the new definitions are linked to two pieces of legislation, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act and the Every Student Succeeds Act. This slide shows the list of terms that are linked to WIOA, including things like career pathways, industry or sector partnerships, and recognized post-secondary credentials. That recognized post-secondary credential term is very important because it's also used in the accountability system, as you'll see in a few slides, and it represents not just a post-secondary credential as it might appear based on the wording in that phrase, but the full range of credentials that students might earn after high school or in addition to a high school diploma. They include things like industry certifications, apprenticeship certificates, post-secondary certificates, and degrees. So a wide spectrum of credentials is included in that recognized post-secondary credential definition. Under the Every Student Succeeds Act, we see new definitions for things like dual and concurrent enrollment, English learners, high school, evidence-based, and several of the support staff that are mentioned later in the law as well, including paraprofessionals and specialized instructional support personnel and services. In addition to those new definitions that are included related to WIOA and ESSA, there's also a set of definitions that are new specific to Perkins. probably the most significant of these are the new definitions for CTE concentrator and CTE participant, and I'll talk about the concentrator definition in a minute related to accountability, as well as the definition of program of study. As all of you know, programs of study were first instituted in the 2006 Act, but there wasn't a formal definition. There was just a description of the term in the state plan sections of the law. And so this new Act formalizes that definition of a program of study and moves it to the definitions section so that it's very clear what we're talking about when we're talking about programs of study, and so that it's easier to reference from other pieces of federal legislation or other documents as well. Another significant new definition is for professional development. And originally when this bill first came out, that definition was linked to the ESSA definition for professional development, but as we looked at that throughout the few weeks that the Senate worked on their bill, it was clear that that ESSA definition really wasn't reflective of professional development needs in CTE, and so that definition was created and tweaked specifically for CTE programs, and so there's a new definition of professional development in this law. A few definitions were eliminated. All of these are either to tech prep related terms, since that title was eliminated, or to other terminology that has since been replaced with new definitions. For example, displaced homemaker was replaced in this new law with out of the workforce individual, and individuals with limited English proficiency were replaced with the English learner definition from ESSA. And so even though these terms were eliminated, don't feel like they're not important in the legislation anymore. They've just been replaced with more updated terminology. In addition to all of those new terms, there were several definitions that are significantly changed from current law. A couple that I want to point out are the definition of CTE, which has expanded language around things like career exploration and career development, dual enrollment, work-based learning, some of the elements of high-quality CTE programs, and the definition of an eligible institution and eligible recipient. This is a key part of the federal statute determining who is eligible for funding, and both of those definitions look a little bit different in this law. However, the only substantive change that's been made is the addition of Indian tribes or tribal organizations as eligible recipients of funds. The other changes are merely kind of rearranging the order of institutions as they're listed in those definitions. I should also point out that the definition of an eligible entity that was new on the last slide is only for the competitive grant within the national program section of the law. It's a small pilot competitive innovation program. That eligible entity definition does include a lot more partners potentially in consortia to apply for those innovation dollars, but it has no impact on the institutions that are eligible for basic state grant funding. The next section of the law that I want to touch briefly on is the prohibition section, and until this reauthorization, we as an organization and as a CTE community had really not paid much attention to this section of the law. It had never been very significant on the ground in Perkins implementation. However, with the debate over secretarial authority really taking center stage, the debate over prohibitions followed and became a big part of that conversation. However, ultimately, the most controversial new prohibitions on the Secretary were not included in this new law. And there are only a couple of new things that really don't have much substantive impact at all. One is that there are some new references in the prohibition language to prohibiting requirements around the Common Core state standards or other common academic standards. These prohibitions already apply in the Every Student Succeeds Act, so don't represent any new direction for Perkins and really aren't terribly relevant to CTE in the first place. And then there's a new requirement for congressional review of any regulations that are proposed under the new Perkins Act. And again, this isn't terribly relevant or important because we haven't had regulations under Perkins in many years, and that is not expected to change with this reauthorization in this administration. So those new prohibitions will have very little impact on the day-to-day operation of the program. Next, we have authorization levels. This bill, like the last Perkins Act, provides for a 6-year authorization period. The authorization levels are included for the first time in a Perkins Act. Under the prior law, we saw terminology that said such sums as necessary, which was a phrase that had been used in a number of pieces of legislation to indicate that the appropriations committees could determine the appropriate amount of funding, which is what they do anyway. However, there are new kind of policies in place in the House of Representatives that requires authorization levels, and so we got them in this bill. You'll see that the numbers go up just a little bit each year and end up with about a 10.5% increase over the course of the 6 years relevant to current funding levels, which are $1.192 billion for the basic state grant. It's really important to note, however, that these authorization levels are just suggestions and are in no way binding on the appropriations committees. It's still completely up to the appropriations committee to determine how much funding we get for the basic state grant. These levels may serve as a guide, but for example, we have already seen a House appropriations bill for FY19 that includes an appropriation for Perkins that's above the level included here, significantly above that level. And so we're hopeful that that House number will prevail in this year's appropriations process and then will continue to grow significantly, not be held back by these authorization levels. Shifting into the meat of the legislative text, we want to talk a little bit about the state allocation. The formula for federal to state funding does stay essentially the same. However, there is a significant change to the hold harmless provision in current law and the way it affects funding going forward. Essentially, the current hold harmless, which was linked to the 1998 funding levels, was eliminated, and it was replaced with a new terminology around a foundational grant that ensures that as long as federal funding levels stay the same or higher than they are right now for FY 2018, that each state will receive a foundational grant equal to their FY 18 funding levels. So essentially, the practical implication of that is that the hold harmless is updated to 2018 funding levels. The law goes on to say that any additional funds appropriated over the FY 2018 funding levels will be distributed by the same population and poverty-based formula that exists in current law. One of the practical implications of that is that it will reduce how dramatic increases or cuts might be going forward. If the Perkins allocation is reduced below the FY 2018 level, then funding levels will be ratably reduced, the same percentage cut for every state. And if funding levels are increased, States will first receive that foundational grant, so only the increase will be affected by changes in population or poverty across the country. Once states get those allocations, there are just a few small tweaks to the within-state allocation. States can still spend up to 10% of their funds on leadership activities. However, within that 10%, the current Perkins Act allowed up to 1% to be spent on individuals in state institutions. Now that has been raised to up to 2%. And there's also a new requirement for some state leadership funds to be spent on the recruitment of special populations. However, the numbers included, the lesser of 0.1% or $50,000, are very small, and in some states that 0.1% could be as small as just a few $100s. Even in larger states, it could be just a few $1,000s because it's not referenced as a percent of the total grant allocation. It's linked to the total amount of leadership dollars, so reduces the pot as to which that 0.1% is applied to. The other change to the within-state allocation is to the reserve fund. Currently, states have to spend at least 85% of their overall allocation on local recipients, and that stays the same, but current law allows states to reserve up to 10% of those dollars to distribute through some method different from the formula, and that number is raised to 15%, so it allows states to hold up to 15% of their local funds and distribute them through an alternative method. That might be a different formula. It might be a competition. It might be for a very specific purpose in the state. And states have been using these reserve funds over the past authorization cycle to do a number of really innovative things, and so that should be able to continue under the new Perkins Act. There are some new parameters on how that reserve fund can be used, and the law specifically now says that it either has to be for innovation or for programs of study or career pathways aligned to high-skill, high-wage, or in-demand occupations or industries. So just putting a few guardrails on how those reserve funds are spent. The next section of the law is the accountability section, and if we're looking across the entire piece, much like the definition section, this is a place that will look very different. The biggest change related to the indicators themselves is that all the measures are now linked to concentrators in statute. That was the current practice. Every state developed a definition of a CTE concentrator, and that's the population that they reported on for the accountability indicators. But now there's a definition of a CTE concentrator in statute. And that definition is on this slide, word for word, from the legislation. At the secondary school level, it's a student served by an eligible recipient who has completed at least 2 courses in a single CTE program or program of study. And at the post-secondary level, it's a student enrolled in an eligible recipient who has earned at least 12 credits within a CTE program or program of study, or if the program is shorter than 12 credits or the equivalent, who has completed that program. So as you think about the performance indicators on the next 2 slides, think about the fact that you'll be measuring those populations of students. And there will be, actually let me go back, there will be some room for states to put some kind of local adaptations on this definition. For example, at the secondary level, it references a single career and technical education program or program of study. Those programs or programs of study will have to be defined somewhere, either at the state level or the local level, depending on the structure for program approval in a state. And so, you know, a state might say something like, you know, middle school courses are not part of the program or the program of study, or, you know, the introductory course that every student in our state has to take doesn't count as part of the program. There are some decisions that states and locals will have to make around what defines that program or program of study in which, the two courses would be involved. And more of those decisions and conversations will occur as we move further away from the bill becoming law and into the implementation stage. So now back to the indicators themselves. At the secondary level, we see a slightly shorter list of indicators than in current law. They have streamlined this list in a couple of places. One is around graduation rates. Instead of being both a graduation rate and a separate completion rate, there's now just one rate, and that is the 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rate from current law, but with an option to include extended year rates if a state is interested in doing that. We also see the academic attainment indicator very similar to current law. One difference in this new legislation is because it references sections of the Every Student Succeeds Act that require assessments in English, math, and science. It appears that we'll have performance indicators under Perkins for all 3 of those subject areas instead of just English and math as in current law. The next measure is a placement measure, and again, this looks very much like current law. The big difference in the placement measure is that it is specifically tagged to the second quarter after the exit from secondary education. So that will be measured in a consistent time period across the country. The other place where we saw some consolidation is in the non-traditional indicator. Current law has non-trad participation and non-trad completion indicators, and this new law at both the secondary and the post-secondary level collapses those into just one indicator, and that will be the percentage of CTE concentrators in programs that lead to non-traditional fields. The other big change at the secondary level is the elimination of the very general technical skill attainment measure to be replaced with a program quality indicator. And the program quality indicator gives states 3 options. Every state will have to choose one of the following indicators. Student attainment of recognized post-secondary credentials while they're in high school, and remember that that includes industry certifications, which is what most high school students would be earning, not necessarily that students would have to earn post-secondary degrees while they were in high school. The second option is attainment of post-secondary credit within the CTE program through dual enrollment or articulation or other types of credit transfer agreements. And then the third option is participation in work-based learning. The decision about which of these indicators to choose will be made by the state eligible Perkins agency, and I'm guessing will be the subject of a great deal of conversation as states go through their public comment process and stakeholder engagement process. In some states, they have already been measuring one or more of these things, so the decision might be relatively easy. In other states, all of these would be new measures, and so they'll be picking one of those. In addition to those 3, states may also include any other measure that is statewide, valid, reliable, and comparable, and this is where technical skill assessments, statewide technical skill assessments might fit in if a state wanted to continue to report results on technical assessments to the federal government. At the post-secondary level, the list is also significantly streamlined and is even shorter than the secondary list. These post-secondary measures were, as I like to say, inspired by the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, but they do not fully align, even when the concepts are the same. The inspiration, though, led to the collapse of 2 of the current post-secondary indicators, the one on retention in education and the one on placement in employment. And instead, now you have a much cleaner measure that looks at where students go after they leave the program, a true placement measure. And if a student continues on into education, that would be a positive placement. If they go into the military or a service program or employment during that second quarter after program completion. All of those would be considered positive outcomes. Another change at the post-secondary level, much like the secondary level, is the elimination of the technical skill attainment measure. At the post-secondary level, this credential attainment measure really becomes a proxy for that attainment of technical skills, because post-secondary credentials, whether that be traditional degrees or certificates or industry certifications, are really the true measure of technical skill attainment at the post-secondary level. And then finally, the non-traditional indicator is collapsed just like it was at the secondary level. So post-secondary programs will really have only three areas in their accountability system. There are also fairly significant changes to the process of setting accountability targets, and this was an area that was of great debate as we moved through the Senate process, trying to get this language as clean as possible and as user-friendly as possible. Instead of the current process where states negotiate their performance targets with the federal government, they will include them in their state plan for all 4 years of the plan at the very beginning of the planning cycle. The Secretary of Education will still have the authority to either approve or not approve those performance levels as part of the state plan review, but it is designed as a process to remove some of the involvement of the Secretary in setting those targets. There are a new set of specific requirements for those performance levels that states must follow, including that they must continually make meaningful progress toward improving the performance of all CTE students, including subpopulations. And there's 4 more requirements that form somewhat of a checklist as states are setting their performance levels. There are also new stakeholder review and comment periods related just to the performance targets. So in addition to the stakeholder review and involvement in the state plan itself, there would have to be a separate process providing input on the performance targets. There are some allowances for adjustments before the 3rd year of the plan, so after the first 2 years, states can make adjustments. And in the case of unanticipated circumstances like natural disasters or changes in state assessments. The caveat to these adjustments is that if a state or a local program, because these requirements mirror at the state to local level as well, is in an improvement plan, then the ability to change your targets is eliminated. The requirements around improvement plans are the same as under current law. If a state or local fails to meet at least 90% of a target, then they have to complete an improvement plan. And as soon as that improvement plan is triggered, the ability to alter performance targets for future years is eliminated by this law. And that's a pretty significant change from current statute. If after implementing an improvement plan, a state or local still fails to make progress and isn't able to hit their targets for 2 years after the improvement plan, then sanctions could be applied. And this is effectively the same as current law. The provision is worded a little bit differently. Current law talks about 3 years total, and the new Perkins 5 talks about 2 years after the improvement plan is triggered. So it is the equivalent of 3 years as well. One other piece on the accountability that I want to point out is that data disaggregation is a big theme in this legislation, and all the current data disaggregation requirements remain. So disaggregating data by special population group and by categories of students identified in the Every Student Succeeds Act, which include things like race and gender, those all remain. In addition, there is disaggregation by program of study or cluster added where that data is available. And so states and local programs will be tasked with disaggregating their performance data either by program of study or by career cluster. There's also some new disaggregation language around the post-secondary and secondary placement measures and identifying whether students were enrolled in in further education or employed or in the military. Even though that language has not appeared in the statute before, it has been current practice. So that doesn't mark much of a difference from current practice. Moving through the legislation, the next section is the national program section of the law. There are a number of changes here, and I don't want to spend a lot of time because they don't have as direct of an impact on people on the ground, but one big change is that the director of the Institute for Education Sciences is given a much more significant role in overseeing CTE research and evaluation. The current national assessment of CTE is significantly revised, and instead of being designed as a one-time assessment and report, it's designed as a series of activities and evaluations that would be updated every 2 years. There is also no specific national research center required. There could be one single center, or there could be a number of contracts grants awarded to institutions of higher education or consortia, including institutions of higher education and other nonprofit organizations, to conduct research under this new law. And then finally, I mentioned earlier, as it related to the definition of an eligible entity, there's a new Competitive Innovation and Modernization Fund grant embedded in the National Programs section of the law. And this new grant would allow the Secretary to take 20% of the national programs dollars, which right now are around $8 million, and disseminate those through a competitive grant process to focus on research-based innovation and modernization within CTE programs. The next section of the law is the state plan. One big change here is that the state plan would be for a 4-year period instead of a 6-year period. And this is really designed so that based on the timing of the passage of Perkins and how it aligns with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, it would align those two state plan periods so that the next time states were updating their WIOA plans would be the same time they're doing their Perkins plans. That would make it easier if a state decided to do a combined plan with WIOA. This new law also includes a suggestion that states can submit another 4-year plan after their current plan ends. And that's a bit of a departure from current practice, which only allowed for 1-year extensions of state plans from year to year after the authorization period ended. So this would allow for states to do a new 4-year plan if they chose to after their current 4-year plan ended. Within the state plan section, there is also more expanded consultation language with specific groups and a new 30-day public comment period that's required on the state plan. And again, these are on top of the consultation and public comment periods required on the performance levels. There's also new language around consultation with governors and governor sign-off of the plans. This language mirrors what occurred under the Every Student Succeeds Act plan development, where governors had 30 days to sign off on ESSA plans. However, the governor's signature is not required, and plans can proceed to the Department of Education without the governor's signature. Within the state plan requirements themselves, there are now 14 plan elements instead of 20, but many of these plan requirements are quite extensive, and I'm going to go through those on the next couple of slides. I'm not going to read every one, but we'll give you a minute just to kind of take a look. The first few really focus on WIOA alignment and alignment with the state's overall workforce development system. So these first 3 state plan requirements were really drawn kind of in the WIOA realm. And then we get into some more process-oriented types of state plan requirements. A description of the CTE programs that are going to be supported by the state, how the state's going to approve eligible recipients for funds, how the state's going to use their leadership funds, split funds between secondary and post-secondary education, determine levels of performance. Those types of process things are more prevalent in the state plan in this new law than they were under Perkins 4. There are still some programmatic elements, like how the state's going to support the recruitment and preparation of educators and how they're going to ensure strategies for special populations are successful, but more process-oriented elements. Many of these elements did exist under current law but didn't look exactly the same. And so there's a lot of variation in exactly how these things are framed in the new act. Moving on to leadership funds and state uses of funds, we see that this also looks significantly different than current law. Current law had a set of 9 required uses of funds and then 17 permissive uses of funds, and the required uses of funds were really the kind of meat of state leadership activities. The new bill moves around the content and places these 5 required uses of funds in a different section. They're not actually labeled as required uses of funds, but the implication of the language is that all 5 of these things are required by states using their leadership dollars. The first one is supporting preparation for non-traditional fields, and this aligns with the requirement early in the law that states spend $60,000 to $150,000 of their leadership dollars on preparing students to enter non-traditional fields. The second requirement is supporting individuals in state institutions, and again, this does align with that leadership breakdown earlier in the law. However, in the past, this was an optional use of funds, and now it is required. The next 2 are things that are very prevalent right now in state leadership budgets. One is recruiting, preparing, or retaining CTE educators, including professional development and leadership development programs. And then the next one is supporting technical assistance for eligible recipients. So those do form really the foundation of what most states do with their leadership dollars right now. The other new addition to the required uses of funds is reporting on the effectiveness of the funds in achieving the goals described in the state plan. The permissive uses of funds, since the required uses have become shorter, the permissive uses have become much longer, now includes 25 items. Notable activities are things like programs of study, articulation agreements, industry partnerships, CTSOs, career guidance and counseling, all of the other types of things that you might typically associate state leadership dollars with. And the section ends with the phrase, any other state leadership activities that improve career and technical education. And so the door is really wide open for how states spend their leadership dollars. And then the final section of the law that I want to talk about is the local section in the few minutes we have left. And this is a place in the law that was also significantly streamlined. However, the addition of the new local needs assessment will require additional activity and work on behalf of local programs. So overall, I would say it's pretty similar to current law, but the structure of the local application itself looks quite a bit different. The local application really includes 3 pieces. The application requirements themselves, the local needs assessment, and the consultation process. And I'm going to start with the application itself. There are just 9 things that have to be included in the local application, but the law specifies, as does current law, that states can add additional requirements to this. The very first thing is the results of the needs assessment, and that is designed to drive the entire local process, as you'll see when we get to the needs assessment on the next slide. The next thing is the courses and activities to be supported by Perkins, which does still have to include at least one state-approved program of study mirroring the requirement in current law. Other requirements for the local application are descriptions of career guidance and counseling, of academic and CTE integration, of activities for special populations, work-based learning, secondary, post-secondary connections, and teacher preparation, recruitment, retention, and professional development. Those are all very fundamental foundational aspects of what local programs do to operate high-quality CTE programs, so serve as the foundation of that local application. And then finally, there's a new requirement for a description of how the eligible recipient is going to address disparities or gaps in performance among subpopulations. And in the local application, this is not asking you to determine the actual strategies you're going to use, because at the point that you're developing this local application, you don't actually have data about performance gaps, but it's more about the process that the local recipient is going to use to gather that data, look at disparities or gaps in performance, and then decide what strategies might be used each year of the local application. So as I said, the very first requirement for the local application was the results of the needs assessment. And this is probably the single biggest new piece of this piece of legislation. The needs assessment is modeled after Title II and Title IV of ESSA, so you may be in school districts, particularly at the secondary level, where you've already been through this process and can build your Perkins process on the ESSA results. The needs assessment has to be conducted before the initial local application is submitted and then updated at least once every 2 years. There's a long list of groups and stakeholders that have to be consulted regularly on the needs assessment process, and that includes the stakeholders from current law as well as a few additional groups, but really focuses on business and industry and community members that will have a voice in this needs assessment process. There are 6 key areas that will have to be covered in the needs assessment. They are student performance, the size, scope, and quality of programs, labor market alignment, the progress in implementing high-quality programs and programs of study, the improvement in educator recruitment, retention, and training, and strategies for equal access to special populations. To really summarize, the needs assessment is an evaluation of where you are right now and what needs still exist within your CTE programs, and should be a very data-driven process. That's why it leads off with student performance data and also includes labor market data. And then that data-driven needs assessment serves as the driver for how funding is spent. The local uses of funds section now says that each eligible recipient has to use funds to meet the needs identified in the comprehensive needs assessment. And there's a great deal of flexibility provided, and certainly the recognition that the amount of Perkins funds you receive is likely not enough to meet every need identified in the needs assessment. But there now has to be a very clear link between the results of the needs assessment and what you found in your local area to be your most pressing needs within your CTE programs and how your Perkins funding is spent. There's also still the requirement that funds have to be used to support CTE programs that are of sufficient size, scope, and quality to be effective. And then there's a much shorter list of required uses of funds, now only 6, and so more evidence that you should really use that needs assessment to drive how you spend your dollars. The 6 that are left are pretty core activities: career exploration and career development, professional development, skills necessary to pursue high-skill, high-wage, or in-demand occupations or sectors, which is really what CTE is. What all CTE is about, the integration of academics into CTE, and the elements that lead to increased student achievement within CTE programs and programs of study, as well as evaluation activities. That number 5, supporting the implementation of program elements resulting in increased student achievement contains a list under it of 20 permissive activities. And that's where you'll see almost all of the current permissive uses of funds and any required uses that don't show up on this shorter list. It includes things like CTSOs and equipment and dual enrollment and work-based learning, much like the state list of permissive uses of funds. They're not called required and permissive uses anymore, but because in the legislation they are referenced with either a may or a may include or language like that, it leaves them as options for local programs. The local list, much like the state list, ends with, anything else that's going to help support these programs. So there is still a great deal of flexibility. However, any choices that are made about spending local dollars will have to be linked back to that needs assessment. Finally, I just wanted to highlight one or two changes in Titles 2 and 3 of the law, which are the administrative provisions. First, there are tweaks to the maintenance of effort requirements, which require states to continue their investment in CTE in order to access their federal dollars. The new requirements allow a one-time reset at the beginning of the law, allowing states to change their baseline to 95% of what it is now. A couple of more exemptions are also added to the maintenance of effort requirements, and these changes are designed to provide a bit more flexibility for one-time state spending so that state legislatures are not discouraged from offering, kind of one-time special grants that might then impact their future maintenance of effort requirements. Another big change in this section of the law is the elimination of the restriction on using funds below 7th grade. Current law said that you could not use Perkins funds on students below 7th grade, but that reference has been changed to below the middle grades, and that middle grades term is defined in ESSA as grades 5 through 8. So there is a bit more flexibility there for states as well. There's also a couple of new data and research-related pieces in these parts of the law. One is a new GAO study on programs of study aligned to high-skill, high-wage occupations and how special populations are able to access those programs. And then another piece is some amendments to what's called the Wagner-Pizer Act, which provides occupational data to programs under the workforce investment system, and the amendments there would require that data to also be provided within the CTE system as well. So I know that was a very quick overview and a very fast hour of information. So we're going to take just a few questions here on the webinar today, as we have a couple minutes left, but I also want people to know how to ask us more in-depth questions or questions you think of after you've had a bit of time to digest the information from today. One is to tweet questions at us using the hashtag AskPerkins5 at our new Twitter account. Another is to email questions to publicpolicy@acteonline.org with the subject line Perkins5 question. That will make sure that your question gets answered in a timely manner and doesn't get mixed up with other things we're receiving during this very busy time. We've also created a specific web page on our site for Perkins implementation resources, and we already have a summary of the new law posted there. We'll post the recording of this presentation there, as well as the slides from today and other as they become available. So with that, I think we would be happy to take questions for just a couple of minutes. You can either unmute your phone and ask them on the recording, or type a question into the Q&A box on the webinar. So I see one question that's come in on the Q&A, and it says, what is the definition of a course in the CTE concentrator definition? There is no definition of course, so that is something that states will be able to define, much like the program or program of study piece of that definition. It could be that a state defines course as has to be a certain length, or only includes some courses. That will be up to states to decide. The next question I see is, where can we see the final Perkins 5 document as signed? The signed version of the bill is not available yet. When it is, it will be posted on the Library of Congress website, and we will link to it on our website. The latest version available right now is the version passed by the House, and that is currently available on the Library of Congress website as well. One more, I see a couple more questions in the chat that we'll answer, and then wrap up for the day. So there's a question about the definition of work-based learning for the program quality indicator. There is a definition of work-based learning in the legislation, and it talks about a continuum of activities offered to students, resulting in meaningful engagement with business and industry. It does not require them to be at a work site. It offers, other alternatives like simulated experiences or virtual experiences. However, I think for the purposes of the program quality indicator, states will need to put some more parameters around exactly what work-based learning will count, because you'll have to be able to identify some experience that is countable if a state chooses that indicator. And the definition that's included in the law includes a number, because it references a range or a sequence of activities. It doesn't lend itself to being specific enough to define how you would count. So states will have to add a few more parameters to that. And one more question. The question is, in my opinion, does the new law give post-secondary partners a stronger position in terms of control oversight of the funds? I would say no. The new legislation leaves the decision about the split of funds and the eligible agency completely up to states. There are no changes to any of the references in that regard in the new law. And so that will continue to be a state-driven decision. All right. Well, I know we are just over an hour, and I don't see any more questions that have come in. I encourage everybody, as you're going through the details or working with your colleagues, to please send us your questions as they come up. That will help us as we determine what resources are needed moving forward into the implementation process. We already have a number of additional resources planned, but want to make sure that we are meeting the needs of the field as we move forward. So thank you to everybody who was able to join the webinar today, and we look forward to working with you over the next few years of implementation. Have a great day.